Again, my heartfelt thanks to all of you. I confess that part of my motivation in putting this event together is so that I could have a captive audience to give this particular talk. So you've all fallen into my trap, and I have you for the next roughly an hour. So this is going to be a little bit of a mix of... I'm going to try to walk with y'all through a particularly important thread in my own life from the last 11 or 12 years, and then some. And so I hope you guys will be able to see the whole arc. I'm really going to try to stick with it. There's going to be a lot of poetry in it, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time. Some of it, I'm just going to read it for you or recite it. You're not supposed to sit there and analyze it. I want to present it to you. Some of it's Hopkins, and so I will go ahead and make the apology for Hopkins, which is that he places a tremendous emphasis on the musicality of poetry. And so if you thought, how did that sentence get constructed? I don't understand. It's okay. Just you're supposed to let it kind of run over you. Not in the sense of being hit by a car, but in the sense of a gentle stream of water or something like that, or music. So that's really what I want to get. That's kind of the only thing I need to say to get started. If you want to know what any of these poems were at the end, just let me know, and I can tell them all to you. But I'm going to start with two poems by Hopkins. And the first one is called "As Kingfishers Catch Fire." As kingfishers catch fire, as dragonflies draw flame, as tumbled over rim and roundy wells, stones ring, like each tuck string tells, each hung bell's bow swung finds tongue to fling out broad its name. Each mortal thing does one thing and the same, deals out that being indoor each one dwells. Selves goes itself, myself, it speaks and spells, crying, what I do is me, for that I came. I say more, the just man justices, keeps grace, that keeps all his goings graces, acts in God's eyes, what in God's eyes he is, Christ. For Christ plays in 10,000 places, lovely in limbs, and lovely in eyes not his, to the Father, through the features of men's faces. And this is called God's grandeur. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. It gathers to a greatness like the ooze of oil crushed. Why do men then now not wreck his rod? Generations have trod, and all is seared with trade, bleared, smeared with toil, and wears man's smudge and shares man's smell. The soil is bare now, nor can foot feel, being shod. And for all this, nature is never spent. There lives the dearest freshness deep down things. And though the last lights off the black west went, O morning, at the brown brink eastward springs, because the Holy Ghost over the bent world broods with warm breast and with awe bright wings. So I'm going to start with a quote from a book that I'm deeply indebted to in this topic, and it is called World as Word. It's by a professor down at the University of Dallas on Gerard Manley Hopkins, which I haven't actually ever read all of. But there are several chapters of it that are kind of powerhouses in my mind. And in that, Dr. Ward quotes Hopkins talking about his poetry and his perception of the world. And he says this, "But indeed, I have often felt that when I have been in this mood and felt the depth of an in-stress, or how fast the Inscape holds a thing, that nothing is so pregnant and straightforward to the truth as a simple yes and is." I am going to read that a second time, because if you don't know what I'm talking about, which you probably don't, because Hopkins had a propensity to make his own words. But indeed, I have often felt when I have been in this mood and felt the depth of an in-stress, that's one we're going to come back to, or how fast the Inscape, that's another one, holds a thing, that nothing is so pregnant and straightforward to the truth as a simple yes and is. So where I want to start is with subjectivity and individual experience. This has obviously been a thing that people have been wrestling with for a while, right? We're individuals. There's all sorts of even basic biological things that contribute to different experiences of the world around us. If you're like this and then you bend down, the room looks different, right? So your height, how well your eyes work, when you wake up, when you go to sleep, the way your voice sounds, how good your hearing is, all this. And then there's experiential stuff. There's your education. All these things obviously contribute to different perceptions of the world around us. This is part of the reason that we enjoy talking to people, other people. It's part of the reason we hate talking to other people, because of this difference. But we want to get to the truth, right? Nothing is so pregnant and straightforward to the truth as a simple yes and is. How do you deal with this? How do you deal with the fact that people approach things differently? They see things differently. They talk about things differently. And how do you deal with the fact that you have things that you can't seem to communicate? Or even if you do communicate, how can you be sure if you have communicated them? How do you know if someone else has seen the same things, has heard the same things? Like it's an old problem. And I would say most people look at that and they're like, yeah, that's when postmodernism came in, when people started saying like, ooh, we've got this issue of subjectivity and how do we resolve all this? And the answer is, of course, that's not when people started wrestling with this, because nothing is ever like that. And Father Gerard Manley Hopkins, who was a Jesuit priest in the middle of the 1800s, he was from the UK, what's now the UK. He was mostly in England, and then he ended up in Dublin at the end of his life. He and his mentor, St. Cardinal John Henry Newman, who I know some people in this audience have a deep love for, the two of them were wrestling with this exact problem. How do you deal with the multiplicity of subjective experience? It's exactly that wrestling that actually drew me to Hopkins. So a little bit of biography. When I was in college, at some point I thought I should probably figure out how to like poetry. And so I asked someone I knew for a recommendation, and they said, Hopkins and Milton. So I read Pied Beauty, and sure, whatever. I mean, now it's great, but it just didn't like really do anything for me. I'm being perfectly honest here. So then I thought, well, I guess I'll try the other one. And so then I started reading Paradise Lost. And that was the second poem that I think I chose to read. It's not my recommendation if you're going to like try to figure out poetry that you're like, yeah, I'll just sit down and read the whole Paradise Lost, because I don't know, it's like 12,000 lines of poetry in English that's trying to be Latin. So there you go. Not a great entry point. But when I came back to Hopkins about 2 years after that, this would have been 2014. When I read, I think it was As Kingfishers Catch Fire, it struck me that Hopkins was talking about something that I had personally experienced. These, let's say, a flash of perception that I would occasionally be granted, times when I'm out walking by myself or something like that. You know, Wordsworth, the poem that Emma read from Wordsworth, right? There's this particular kind of experience that apparently people have stumbled upon, and then it causes them to write poetry, because I guess we don't have a word for it. Father Eric brought up in his talk earlier today this after wit, or the French word for staircase wit, right? There are these things that we're trying to get a hold on, right? How do we talk about that feeling, right? Or in Prufrock, right? That's not what I meant at all, right? There's this grappling with how do we bridge the inside-outside. There's many reasons that's so important. One of the reasons that's so important is that's how we're in a relationship. Like, if you're going to be in a relationship with another being, with another person, not another being, right? You can have relationships with all sorts of beings that don't involve that sharing, right? I don't need that with a tree. I don't need it with a rock. I don't need it with a dog, but I need it with another person. So if we're going to be in a relation with another person, you have to deal with this subjective quality. So Newman and Hopkins were dealing with this, and they're trying to figure out, what do we do with this multiplicity of personal experience? And this is what Newman came to. He came to this idea that there are many possible apprehensions that are proper to a single entity. And I'm reading a quote. If this sounds stilted, that's why, because it's a quote. This is written language, not spoken language. Since a reality is what is intelligible to any person, everything real has latent in itself an endless store of real apprehensions that people may learn to know. A relative infinite, such as Hopkins finds in the human soul. Okay, so that right there, a relative infinite. This notion that every bit of reality has an endless possible unfolding that could hold for you. And when I say reality or thing, I want to broaden this out. I don't mean just physical objects. I mean phenomena, I mean words, I mean persons, anything that you can relate to, right? Anything that you can have an intelligible relationship to. There is, what Newman is saying here is that there's an infinite possible number of ways to relate to it. Okay, is that good? Well, maybe it's good because it says that our subjective approach to a thing may or may not actually be true, because we're no longer looking at it and saying, well, I think about something one way and Father Eric thinks about something one way and Parker thinks about something one way, and they're all different. And so one of us is right and the other people are wrong, right? Because that's one of the traps you could get into with subjective experiences, to say, well, if there's a thing out there that we're trying to connect to, that we're trying to see, and we're seeing differently, it means most people are wrong and one person's right, or maybe no one's right. And Newman is trying to get away from that. He's trying to say, no, hold on, look. The capacity of reality is actually to bring forth functionally an infinite number of possible apprehensions that are all appropriate to it. And you can think about this on a basic level, and you can think, okay, a great example is a tree. Again, why is a tree a great example? Because you could go out in one day and look at it many times, and the light is changing over the course of the day, right? Or you could look at it at different times of the year, especially if it's like a deciduous tree in this part of the world. Sometimes it's got leaves on it, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the leaves are green, sometimes they're red. And now I'm sort of doing poetry because hopefully you're starting to see a tree differently, right? Because it's like, whoa, that's kind of a weird thing. That it's just like, there's this object that lives outside that changes all the time, and it's got its own life. You're starting to see it a little bit. Okay, which of those is the proper way to see the tree? Well, it's like, oh, they all are, right? So you're looking at this is what Hopkins means when he says inscape. So inscape, he's forming it from the language that we use for like landscape. It's the inner landscape of a thing, right? And so when you think about a landscape, just like the tree, you could stand in different places. There's different vantage points. There's different lighting. And then there's you, right? Because then you can come to the tree and you could be an artist and see it one way. You could be a painter and see it one way. You could be a home builder and you're like, that tree's going to fall on the house and destroy it. You could be an arborist and think that'd be a really hard tree to cut down. You could be a carpenter and think about, right, the potential in that tree, right? Because there's not just the actuality of it, there's also the potential, right? When you plant an acorn, some people might think, oh yeah, that could be a big tree someday, right? That's a proper apprehension of it as well. So we're trying to get some notion here that there's a unity to all of the ways that you can relate to something, both potential, actual, what you might call objective or subjective. And Hopkins designates this as the inscape, right? It is something that you can, not only that you can, that you have to enter into when you approach a thing. Now, what's interesting is that Hopkins says the inscape isn't the thing. The inscape is your apprehension of the thing. And here he's following John Duns Scotius, who my only approach to John Duns Scotius is through Hopkins. So I'm not even going to pretend to tell you what his philosophy is about. But he is very particular on the fact that there is a thing there that God knows. God sees the thing utterly. Because of this possible relative infinity, this relative infinity in our perceptions of things and as limited beings, you never actually exhaust anything in your perception of it, right? There lives the dearest freshness deep down things, right? And yet nature is never spent, right? Hopkins has this notion deep inside of him that reality is rich and it's full. And if you don't limit yourself to say, yeah, I get it, I know what that is, if you approach it with this notion of a tremendous amount there, something that you could never exhaust, and all of a sudden, well, then kingfishers can catch fire and dragonflies draw flame, right? The world is charged with the grandeur of God. Great. Okay, but we've still got to bridge the subjectivity gap, right? Because I'm seeing these things in this inscape and you're seeing these things in this inscape. And what are we going to do about that, right? You can see it from different angles. One of the options in the 1800s was to say that you can't, right? You just like, You see something and I see something, we see different things. And so when we use the same designator for that, the same word to designate that, we either mean the exact same thing, in which case communication isn't worthwhile, or we mean different things, in which case we can't understand each other. There's no possible overlap there. And I would say that's absurd because we can communicate. But the reason that that's absurd is it assumes a one-to-one correspondence with language to object. And that's not how language works. But how the alternative is a many-to-many correspondence. And I'm indebted to Mark for bringing this up. So thank you, Mark. I appreciate that. Or what the way language works is it's a many-to-many correspondence. And I would say that it becomes more clear when you start doing poetry, right? Because then you say, oh, what does Eliot mean when he says a patient, right? This patient etherized in the sky. What does that mean? And there's the sort of shallow answer is to say, oh, well, he means God. It's like, done. We can move on. It's like, that's not good poetry. Good poetry is never, this means this. It's like, what is Beatrice in the Divine Comedy, right? Books have been written about who Beatrice is. Why? Is she divine love? Is she a woman that lived in Florence in the 1300s? She's all of it, right? These things there can be a relationship where one thing bears out many things. Okay, so if we're okay with the many-to-many correspondence, then all of a sudden we can actually communicate with one another. Because now we can say, we're referring to the same thing, and we're seeing different things about it, but when I say one thing, it has a lot of different things. And look, this comes out in normal conversation. This is how conversations flow. I say one thing, I mean it. Oh, that fires something in your head and you go off in that direction. And I don't say, no, that's not what I was talking about. You have to go in this direction. It's like, wow, you've actually opened up the Inscape of my statement by doing that, by relating it to something. So poetry as, say, art, right? As something that we create and we look at and we're like, that's poetry, right? This book, this is a book of poetry, right? What is that poetry? What it's doing is it's taking this notion of many-to-many correspondence and elevating it to an exceptionally conscious degree where you're able to see it and say, oh, that's an image, or it's a symbol, or it's a metaphor. But language is functioning in a very similar way all the time, just slightly more, there's a little bit less wiggle room there, let's say, right? So you're opening these images up. But it's that same process of many-to-many correspondence that lets us communicate. We're still not there yet. We still can't actually communicate, though, because when you refer to something or when you see something, there's an infinite possible number of interpretations. There's an infinite number of possible apprehensions. How do you decide which the right one is? How do I decide which one Father Eric means? Which one? It's the problem of attention. I mean, spoiler, there it is, right? This is a lot of the people in this room are here because of Peugeot, Peterson, and Vervaeke. And I would say probably the fundamental insight that the three of them have together is it's not intrinsically obvious where you should give your attention in any situation. So I was thinking about this example of cutting down a tree. I think we were talking about this last night. And in the act of cutting down a tree, there are certain things that are really important to pay attention to, like how's the top of the tree moving? Can I feel the wood fibers in it popping? Are there people nearby? Right? These are the things I should be paying attention to. I shouldn't be paying attention to what color are my pants? What am I going to have for dinner? What year model is that car that just drove down the road? These are all things how many blades of grass are there within a square meter of me? It's like, and it goes on and on and on. And you have to say, okay, I have to organize my attention some way. And with felling a tree, it's pretty obvious because we've kind of got some things baked into us like, I don't want to die and I don't want to cause mayhem, right? And so that I can go from there and I can start to order my attention. But when you move out of these very, like, let's say, proximate tasks, when you move out of that into more unbounded space, then it becomes a lot harder to order your attention. So my thesis in this first part is essentially this, that poetry works to order your attention. And not just in the sense of, what do I do in this room? Who do I pay attention to? What do I pay attention to? But within that thing, what do I pay attention to about it? Right? What are the right ways to relate to something? When I look at it, what should I see? What could I see that I've never seen before? it broadens up that Inscape, and then it orders it. And this is the same thing that Father Eric was talking about with language, right? If you don't have a word for it, it's harder to see it, okay? There are certain things that we have words for, right? Individual words for, because we're limited beings, right? This comes up over and over. We're limited beings. How many words could you remember? I don't know. Probably couldn't remember 5 million words. Are there 5 million things in the universe? There's a few more than that, right? There's a few more than 5 million things. And so there's a process of selection, right? And so we talk about the things that are important, and we have words for the things that are important. The things that are less important, you build it together. You describe it, right? You have to circumlocute. You have to work around it. You have to write about it. So one of my favorite examples of this, and the way that it shows what's important, is in Quechua, which is right. So it's a language that's spoken in the Andes Mountains and has like basically no etymological connection to any language in Europe. And they have a word there. It's a verb that means to bake corn in an oven that's never been used before. It's one word. And you're like, oh, I see what's important to you, because I don't have a word for that. I have to say corn that's baked in an oven that's never been used before. And so you are treading really close when you're talking about the ability to speak about things to what people call like the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is this notion that your thought is bound by your language. And it's not a hard binding, right? Because obviously you can think things and feel things that you can't express, right? That's not what I meant at all. Again, it's like, how do you feel something that you can't bring out? What language does do, though, is it constrains your attention. So it doesn't limit what you could see or think or feel, but it orders it. It emphasizes it. And so what poetry does is, for one part, is it takes those things that can't be held in a word or have been locked up in a word, right? Your Inscape has narrowed with a word so much that you just see one thing, and it opens it up. It takes that one-to-one correspondence with a word and breaks it apart. I think this is part of Peterson's popularity in his early days, was he was doing exactly this with the Bible and with the idea of God. For many, many people, they had this one-to-one correspondence with, say, Bible has a moral interpretation and that's it. What's the moral of the story? God means this one thing. And he'd walk out on a stage and spend 2 hours talking about all these crazy ways that you could look at, say, one chapter in the book of Genesis, and people were eating it up. Why? Because he was revealing the Inscape of the scriptures. That doesn't mean that he's giving attention necessarily to the right place, but he is opening it up again. So that's the Inscape. In stress is a different aspect of that, and that is how you focus your attention. You put stress on something, okay? So Hopkins' notion of perception is actually, it's just beautifully elegant. He says, you could look at a thing and see its relation to everything, right? There's depth there, but you're one person, and so you have to focus on something. And that is the in stress. He says, I've been in this mood and felt the depth of an in stress, or how fast the Inscape holds a thing, that nothing is so pregnant and straightforward to the truth as a simple yes and is. The in stress, that's yes. The Inscape, that's the is, right? This should be our approach to reality. This is what poetry helps us do at its best. Poetry says is and yes. Because in the end, reality is what we have. So like, we should agree with it. Okay, great. But then, so I've said all that, and I've kind of implied that there are things that are more important and things that are less important. And this should be pretty obvious. But if you're going to give your limited attention to something, the hope is that you should be giving it to more important things rather than less important things. Again, in the case of the tree, it's cutting down the tree. It's more obvious what the important things are. Of course, that's baked into another set of, I should be paying attention to not killing people unintentionally. That's a good thing to give my attention to, right? So it borrows from that, but we need to figure out why we should pay attention to things. And this is one of the really fascinating things to me about poetry. And I'm glad, I'm indebted to Emma for reading that poem from Wordsworth. It's like, why would you spend time writing a poem about the woods when you could write a poem about God? Because it seems like God's more important than like a forest, right? Or if we have time, there's this great soliloquy about someone's cat that I'll read. It's just in praise of his pet cat. Why waste time? Or Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats. Like, why waste time writing a book about cats? A book of poem about cats. And this is one of the other critical things, is that reality is fractal. Okay, sure, many of you have heard that, right? So what does that mean? It means it branches out. It's operating at multiple levels. We were having a conversation yesterday that was wonderful, how like your knowledge of the world around you is deeply fractal. So Arkansas to me has there's all this variation and difference in topography and people and economy and all this stuff. But to most people, if you're in Oklahoma or Missouri and Texas, well, it's just Arkansas. And then if you're living in the Northeast or on the West Coast, it's like, that's like the South. It's all the same, right? And it's exactly, I mean, this is, but you can do that with any part of reality. It's the same thing with a tree. Again, how much do you know about a tree? Oh, it's a tree. Oh, that's an oak tree. Oh, that's a white oak. Oh, that's a white oak that's probably approximately 70 years old and has suffered probably 2 major storms during its life and feeds these animals. And right, your knowledge of these things and down and down and down. There's a wonderful New England ecologist who can do this in the woods. I mean, he walks out and he says, see that lump of dirt right there? That's from the hurricane in 1892, and it fell over at between 11 and 12 p.m. on Christmas Eve. You think, what on earth, man? Get out of here. And then he walks you through how he knows, because he can tell from the remaining wood the rate of decay and the size of the tree and the direction that it blew over and where the eye of the hurricane passed and at what time. And you start to see it. No, all of that's actually embedded in there. But there's this fractal nature to the knowledge. Okay, great. That hasn't resolved the issue of where you give your attention, because why would you spend your time paying attention to a lump of dirt on the ground? Because there's more than one kind of fractal. There's fractals that are merely have multiple levels of detail, and then there's self-similar fractals. And a self-similar fractal is where the small parts have the same pattern as the large parts. And this is this is totally critical. This is absolutely critical. Reality is a self-similar fractal, which means that you can pay attention to things down here and see them really well, and you see the whole thing. And this is what poetry is at its best is doing. So think about a tree again, right? What happens if you cut a limb off of a tree and you stand it upright? It looks like a little tree. What happens if you take a little twig off of that and you stand it upright? It looks like a tiny tree, right? It's the same shape all the way. So what poetry is doing is it's saying, look, you think I can only look up here, and that's it. Anything down here, that's just distracting me. One of the things that poetry can do at its best is to say, look at what's in front of you, and in that relative infinity, you'll actually be able to see everything. I'm going to read a poem from the poet Elizabeth E.B. Browning, and it's a long poem. And so I'm only going to read part of it, and it's still going to be long. This is from Aurora Leigh. And in this twofold sphere, the twofold man, for still the artist is intensely a man, holds firmly by the natural to reach the spiritual beyond it, fixes still the type with mortal vision to pierce through with eyes immortal to the antitype. Some call the ideal, better call it the real. And certain to be called so presently when things shall have their names. Look long enough on any peasant's face here, coarse and lined, and you'll catch Antonius somewhere in that clay, as perfect featured as he yearns at Rome. From marble pale with beauty, then persist, and if your apprehension's competent, you'll find some fairer angel at his back, as much exceeding him as he the boar, and pushing him with imperial disdain, forever out of sight. Aye, Carrington is glad of such a creed. An artist must, who paints a tree, a leaf, a common stone, with just his hand, and finds it suddenly a peace with, and conterminous to his soul. Why else do these things move him, leaf or stone? The bird's not moved, that pecks at a spring shoot, nor yet the horse before a quarry a graze. But man, the twofold creature, apprehends the twofold manner, in and outwardly. And nothing in the world comes singly to him, a mirror itself. Cup, column, or candlestick, all patterns of what shall be in the mount. The whole temporal show related royally and built up to eternal significance through the open arms of God. There's nothing great nor small, has said a poet of our day, whose voice will ring beyond the curfew of eve and not be thrown out by the matin's bell. And truly, I reiterate, nothing small, no lily-muffled hum of a summer bee, but finds some coupling with the spinning stars. No pebble at your foot, but proves a sphere. No chaffinch, but implies the cherubim. And, glancing in my own thin, veined wrist, in such a little tremor of blood, the whole strong clamor of a vehement soul doth utter itself distinct. Earth's crammed with heaven, and every common bush afire with God. But only he who sees takes off his shoes. The rest sit round it and pluck blackberries, and dab their natural faces unaware, more and more from the first similitude. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. So this is poetry at its best. This is poetry that is instructing us how we ought to view the world, to realize that there's nothing small. And I would tell you that this is actually of civilizational importance and eternal importance. Because if we cannot see the value in small things, we'll rip the world apart. We really will. Not only will we tear it to pieces looking for big things, we'll also neglect all the small things, the acorns and the babies and the students that will be the future. Right? So it's vital that we can see how the whole thing runs up and down. And you can look at the small and see the great, right? Where do the saints come from? They come from the people who become like a little child. So great, I've painted this wonderful, beautiful picture of reality in which God's glory shines forth. If you just look and you'll see in a baby's face and the chaffinch's wings and the acorn, hope and beauty and peace and glory, and it's going to be wonderful. Okay, so for part 2, I'm going to read another poem from the first part of a poem from Hopkins. And this is what he says. How to keep, is there any, is there none such, nowhere known some, bow or brooch or braid or brace, lace, latch or catch, or key to keep back beauty. Keep it, beauty, beauty, beauty from vanishing away. Oh, is there no frowning of these wrinkles, ranked wrinkles deep down, no waving off of these most mournful messengers, still messengers, sad and stealing messengers of gray? No, there's none. There's none. Oh no, there's none, nor can you long be what you now are, called fair. Do what you may. What? Do what you may, and wisdom is early to despair. Be beginning since no nothing can be done. To keep at bay age and age's evil, hoar hair, ruck and wrinkle, drooping, dying, death's worst winding sheets, tombs and worms, and tumbling to decay. So be beginning to despair. Oh, there's none, no, 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 there's none. Be beginning to despair, 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 despair. That's not the end of the poem, but you got to sit there for a little while with me. So I'm going to start part 2 of this talk with a quote that Parker shared with me from Tarkovsky's book, The Russian Filmmaker, on art. And he says this: not that the aim of art is to make you happy or to fulfill you or to make you cool. The aim of art is to prepare a person for death, to plow and harrow his soul, rendering it capable of turning to the good. That's the second part of my talk. No. I'm going to try to do a little bit of unpacking on that. But again, that's just when Parker shared that with me, I thought, okay, well, there's half of what I was going to say. From here, I want to take this notion of Inscape and I want to turn it in a particular direction. And because there's one Inscape in particular that I think it's deeply important that we meditate on and we look into and we know what we ought to in-stress. And that is the Inscape of the human person. Okay, so what's in there? That's basically the question. What's in a person? What are they? How can we relate to that person? How can you relate to yourself? And so I've been reflecting on, when I was reflecting on this, the first thing that came to my mind, of course, is Dante, because that's always the first thing that comes to my mind. And in particular, something that struck me when I was talking about the Inferno with some people, and thinking about, so you have, there's multiple levels that you can look at the Divine Comedy at. One is, you can just look at the text itself, and there's Dante the Pilgrim. There's also Dante the writer who writes about Dante the Pilgrim, and there's some degree of autobiography there. But when you think about Dante the writer, his claim is essentially this, that he had some experience seeing a young woman named Beatrice when he was a young man in Florence, and that brought about the Divine Comedy. That's his argument, right? So he actually says at some point in his life, he's written some other books, he's written some love poetry, he's written a book on the monarchy, some other things, and he says, that's it, I'm not writing any more until I can figure out how to write about Beatrice. And he doesn't until he writes the Divine Comedy. So the Divine Comedy is a book about Beatrice. And in that sense, I think the Divine Comedy can be seen appropriately as an examination of the Inscape of the human being. Now, that's good news and it's bad news. And the reason it's bad news is because the first third of it is hell. Okay, so what struck me even, right, that sounds really bad. Here's the interesting thing. And it is bad. It is bad. It's also really good. But here's the fascinating thing. Dante had, here's a way to talk about what happened with Dante and Beatrice. There's part of the Inscape of the human being is that it is the great vehicle of the glory of God in creation. And that is the best news that could come to you. Okay? And what I think happened with Dante in Florence 700 years ago is that he was granted a particular part of the Inscape of this young woman, Beatrice, and that fundamentally reorganized the rest of his life. Now, what's interesting is that you would think that the vision of someone in some part of their heavenly glory would give you a very positive outlook on human beings, fundamentally. And I agree with that, but it's not just a positive outlook, because when you hold Beatrice up, when you say, there she is, I've seen her, it says some really bad things about the rest of your life and about the rest of the world. And so it's fascinating to me, and it makes perfect sense that the poetic investigation of Beatrice, of the experience that he had with Beatrice, would lead him to hell. Because he's seen what man can be, right? Because the Inscape doesn't just contain the actual, it also contains the potential. And when you hold up that potential glory to what's actual and unredeemed man, it looks like hell. That's what it looks like. And so if we're going to come to terms with what people are, you can't do it without looking at hell to some degree, because you won't see what a person is and you won't know where to give your attention. Okay, so there's a lot here. Okay, just skip ahead a little bit because I'm also running long. If you're going to understand the life of a person, one of the things that you have, there's a terrible task in front of you as a person or as a poet or as both. And that is to truly understand the Inscape of a person in a meaningful way, you have to face the Inscape of death. And that's what Dante is doing when he goes into hell. And Gerard Manley Hopkins has a number of poems that are wrestling with it, right? This is the first, what I just read you, The Leaden Echo. Be beginning to despair. There's no holding off death, right? The notion of seeking immortality in this world does not come from knowledge, it comes from ignorance. Real sight sees our limitedness and it sees our capacity for brokenness, okay? But as T.S. Eliot, as Jim and I were talking about T.S. Eliot feeling as though he needed to repent of his earlier despair, there's to in-stress death in your life without this possibility of redemption is sin. In fact, that would be a way to define the sin of despair, is to in-stress death without seeing the possibility of redemption. Okay, which is why you don't just read the Inferno, you read the whole thing. And 2/3 of it, right? 2/3 of it are on the other side of Satan. You have to pass through. But you can't pass through unless you face it. And this is the thing about hell, is that Dante looking at the divine, at the Inferno, is that you have to pass through. And so one of the things that poetry can do for us, and what Tarkovsky argues, is that it is there to prepare us for death, right? It's to be able to look at these things. Because if you're going to be saved, you have to be saved through the truth. And death lives in the inscape of every person. You have to face that. But what poetry can do is, as Father said, it can give us the language to speak about it. It can also help us to rehearse dying. When you look at the Psalms that are prayed at night by the monks, and then you go to a Requiem Mass, it's the same Psalms, right? There's this capacity of sleep to be opened up to us, and to see that every night we are trusting our being to the divine. And if he wakes us up every morning, maybe we can trust he'll wake us up again. So this is the thing. Peterson makes this interesting argument where he says pain is the most fundamental experience. You can't argue with pain. And then he goes on to say in his talk at Logos at Ephesus, maybe there's something more powerful than pain, and that's the thing that removes the pain. And I say no, because drugs can do that for you. And so can death. It can remove the temporal pain. What's more powerful than pain is the thing that can transform the pain. And so related to the inscape of the being, of a person, and related to the inscape of death is the inscape of suffering. Okay? And this is our project. This should be all of our projects, to plumb the depths of the inscape of suffering. And this is why when you go into a Catholic church, there's a beautiful man dying on a cross. And that is an invitation to explore the inscape of suffering. Because suffering isn't just about pain, suffering is also about submitting. Right? This is John Vervaeke, he's the first person that I heard this from. That suffering is the giving up of your agency. Right? The dead do not suffer, the living to pass. Right? Suffering is not just about, ow, that hurts, but I am overridden. I'm not the master. I am contingent. What happens when you don't do that is you end up in hell. But if you can plumb the depths of the inscape of suffering, and you in-stress the possibility of redemption through it, then you can be saved, right? There is nothing more than yes and is in the end. If you will not have yes and is, there's nothing else to be had. Why did not everyone wants to hear what I've just said. And not everyone likes great poetry. And one of the guys here made a wonderful comment about how by listening to too much pop music, it becomes harder to hear real music. And if you sit and don't just be a snob, and you say, why is it that most people want shallow stories and shallow music, and they want allure and not beauty? And I would say it's this, because real vision always reveals both our own lack and our capacity to fail even more. And that's a negative way of putting it. The positive way of putting it is that if we're falling short, we could stop being short. And this is what I would call the moral romance of great poetry. It's the fact that really good poetry looks at you and it says, you're not just what you think you are. You are a many-to-many correspondence, and you contain in yourself a relative infinity. And there is a way that you could relate to reality that would make you of a kind like what Dante saw in Beatrice. right? That leads him to the very vision of God at the end of the Divine Comedy. Which leads me to the beatific vision. Everything should, by the way. And to take Hopkins' language and to, let's say, try to stir up some sort of appropriate interest in this matter. The beatific vision, I think, could be stated as the inscape of all inscapes. It's the ultimate yes, our ultimate yes to the ultimate is. That's what we can be called to. And poetry right now can be the preparation in faith that that's possible, because if you can look at a tree or an acorn or a cat or a coffee party or any of these things, and someone like T.S. Eliot or Dante or Hopkins or Wordsworth or your grandmother can drop the bottom out of it, and all of a sudden there's things there, and you see that, in fact, the world is charged with the grandeur of God, and maybe even somehow suffering is charged with the grandeur of God, then you could put all your cards on the table. Maybe that's the wrong metaphor. You could go all in. You can go all in on the fact that there is something that's worth all of these things, and that you don't end up rage against the dying of the light. No. You only do that when you think there's no more light to come. When you've bounded reality to finitudes that it doesn't actually have. So I'm going to read the second part of the Leaden Echo now. And then I'm going to read another poem from Gerard Manley Hopkins. So be beginning to despair, despair. Spare. There is one. Yes, I have one. Hush there. Only not within the seeing of the sun. Not within the singeing of the strong sun. Tall suns tinging, or treacherous the tainting of the earth's air. Somewhere elsewhere there is, where one. Yes, I can tell such a key. I do know such a place. Where whatever's prized and passes of us, everything that's fresh and fast flying of us, seems to us sweet of us and swift prized of us and passes of us, everything that's fresh and fast flying of us, seems to us sweet of us and swiftly away with, done away with, undone, done with, soon done with, and yet dearly and dangerously sweet of us. The wimple-watered, dimpled, not by morning matched face, the flower of beauty, fleece of beauty, too apt to awe, to fleet, never fleets more, fastened with the tenderest truth to its own best being and its loveliness of youth. It is an everlastingness of, it is an all youth. Come then, your ways and airs and looks, locks made in gear, gallantry, gaiety, and grace, winning ways, airs innocent, maiden manners, sweet looks, loose locks, long locks, love locks, gay gear, going gallant, girl grace. Resign them, sign them, seal them, send them, motion them with breath, and with sighs soaring sighs deliver them. Beauty and the ghost, deliver it, early now, long before death. Give beauty back. Beauty, back to God, beauty's self and beauty's giver. See, not a hair is, not an eyelash, not the least lash lost. Every hair of the head numbered. Nay, what we had light-handed left in surely the mere mold, will have waked and have waxed and have walked with the wind, what while we slept. This side, that side, hurling heavy-handed hundredfold, what while we slumbered. Oh, then, why, when the thing we freely forfeit is kept with a fonder care kept than we could have kept it, kept far with a fonder care, and we should have lost it. Finer, fonder care kept. Where kept? Do but tell us where kept. Where? Yonder. What, as high as that? We follow now. Now we follow. Yonder, yes. Yonder. That nature is a Heraclitean fire, and the comfort of the resurrection, Heraclitean fire. Cloud, puffball, torn tufts, tossed pillows flaunt forth in chevy on the air, built thoroughfare, heaven roisters and gay gangs. They throng, they glitter in marches, down rough cast, down dazzling whitewash. Whatever an elm arches, shave lights and shadow tackles and long lashes lace lance and pear, delightfully the bright wind boisterous, ropes, rustles, beats earth bare of yester tempests creases, in pool and rut, peel, parches, squandering ooze to squeezed, dough, crust, dust, staunches, starches, squadron masks and man marks, treadmire toil there, fret-footed in it, million-fueled, nature's bonfire burns on. But quench her bonniest, dearest to her, clearest selved spark. Man, how fast his fire dent, his mark on mind is gone. Both are an unfathomable, all is in an enormous dark, drowned. O pity and indignation, man-shape that shone sheer off to several a star, death blots black out, nor mark is any of him at all so stark, but vastness blurs and time beats level. Enough! The resurrection, a heart's clarion, away grief's gasping, joyless days, dejection. Across my foundering deck shone a beacon, an eternal beam. Flesh fade and immortal trash fall to the residuary worm. World's wild fire leaves but ash. In a flash, at a trumpet crash, I am all at once what Christ is, since he was what I am. And this Jack, joke, poor potsherd, patch, matchwood, a mortal diamond, is a mortal diamond. So I declare to you, brothers and sisters, that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does the perishable inherit the perishable. Listen, I tell you a mystery. We will not all sleep, but we will all be changed. In a flash, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed. For the perishable must clothe itself with the imperishable, and the mortal with immortality. When the perishable has been clothed with imperishable, and the mortal with immortality, and the saying that was written will come true, death has been swallowed up in victory. And St. Paul ends in verse. Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? Thank you. Do we have any time for questions? Yeah, we got a few minutes for questions. Parker.
So you began your talk with someone leading you down the road of where you should begin with poetry. So what would you tell someone asking if they want to develop an ear for, poetry?
Yeah.
Where would they begin?
Hopkins. And no. So I would actually tell them to begin with humility. Yeah. To just be okay with what's given to them when they read a text. If you sit and think about this notion of Inscape for a little bit as it applies to poetry, you'll immediately realize that there are many appropriate apprehensions of a poem. And so if you read a piece of poetry and you think that was beautiful, but I don't know what it means, great. Really, that's great. So just start there. And so that'd be one place, an anthology of poetry. And just like, if you're reading it and it doesn't come to you, if it doesn't draw you at all, that's fine. Just read until you find something you like and don't worry about it. So that'd be a good place to start. Humility and just a willingness to receive what you're given as you read. So, Eli.
I'm not quite clear on the definition of Inscape.
Yeah.
So were you saying that it is all of the things that can be apprehended about a thing, or all the things that you apprehend about a thing at a given time?
Yes. So, in the way that we use the word landscape, because we could talk about the landscape here, or I could say, oh, what a beautiful landscape out the window, right? So it's both. It's both that actual realm of possible interactions. I don't know if I want to use the word actual term, the real realm of possible relationships, as well as the one that you're seeing at that moment. And that is a matter of the intellect. The in-stress is a matter of the will, right? So if you're understanding the spiritual powers of a person is the intellect and the will, the intellect perceives the inscape and the will in-stresses. It gives attention to that part of it.
Could you, map Hopkins' idea of the inscape onto Plato's forms? Like, is there any relation there?
Yeah, so that's a great question. It's funny because as I was reading it this time in particular, I was noting how much Platonism there is in that E.B. Browning passage that I read. Hopkins, I don't think he is a Platonist. He's more in the Aristotelian camp, but he, for various reasons, particularly his incarnational and sacramental theology, places a deep emphasis on the particular. And so a lot of his poems are about the time I served communion to this particular boy, right? The bugler's first communion, or the poplars on the side of the road at this one place. So he's not a Platonist. There's a sense in which there's a relationship between the particular and the universal that allows you to relate to it, that adds to the intelligibility of it. But I think fundamentally, he believes in a concrete, particular existence of all things that that's not a notion of sort of merely the emanation from some sort of realm of the forms. And so the Inscape, what's interesting is that there's a lot of scholars who read his notion of the Inscape and think he's talking about Plato's forms. So there's a very common thread. I don't buy that for a number of reasons, partially because of his love for John Duns Scotius, partially the way that he writes poetry, and then partially because it's just not what the idea is about. The idea is about particularity.
Could you say like the particular projected onto the eternal?
Well, all particulars participate in the eternal, and that's how they have being. So, in that sense, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was thinking as you were talking how you were saying that both the specificity or the actuality of an object, but also the potentiality of an object are within the Inscape.
Yes.
So that kind of, like all of the Platonic like causes exist, like within the Inscape of like a tree, for instance. But I also think that like the Platonic form of a tree exists within the Inscape of a tree somewhere.
Yeah.
So
If the form is instantiated in the tree, that sounds more like Aristotle than Plato.
It is, yeah. That's more, and he's
Each
falling more.
individual tree has an Inscape, and part of that Inscape might be the Platonic form of a tree, as part of the Inscape of that oak tree or that maple.
That's not work that I've been able to pick apart yet. So.
yeah, so in my understanding of when we use the word tree, we're submitted to the form of a tree. And when we are talking about things like beauty, when I use the word blue is a metaphor for a spectrum of, we map it on. So the nature of language is that it's all metaphorical to some extent. And my understanding of Plato in the Symposium is that there's desire, there's a lower form and a higher form of eroticism or desire. And desire can be, there's like a general desire, like I can desire two women or multiple women, but in the way that the desire is fulfilled is different. In my specific desire for one woman is not the same fulfillment of my desire in another woman, and yet it's under the overarching concept of like this higher level of desire. So I think beauty is in the object. It's not, the nature of beauty is such that it has to do with relations. And the beauty is in the tree, but the beauty of each tree is also has this unique aspect of specificity to every other actor.
So one of the nice things about Inscape, the notion of Inscape, is that it allows for the possibility of a lot of truth in something that someone misses, right? It's like, well, it's not, I can't see it, so it's not there. It's like, well, so there's it's very handy in that way. I think one of the things that I really enjoy about it is that it leaves open the room for much greater understanding and much greater vision of things. It deeply resists the whole just move. Well, that's just whatever, right? That's probably one of the fundamentally important things for what it's doing there is it's just saying, yeah, look again, right? There's this great, Beatrice is always saying this, like, look, we are Beatrice. She says this to Dante over and over, look, like, regard me, basically. Look again. And like, that's the call of, that's what good poetry is doing. It's just saying, like, look more. And Beatrice, as they move up towards God, Dante's moving around with these languages, right? The Inscape of Beatrice deepens for Dante the closer they get to God, which is true of all real things.
I would praise your recitation Ah, thanks.
Partly because for me, my experience with Hopkins in the past, which isn't very deep, but is that I trip over a lot of his. It seems when you read it, at least when I read it early, and I haven't gone deep, so I've only read it early. I trip over this repetitive, similar word, using the same word with the same starting letter, using the word with the same shape.
Yes.
And I trip over that as a impediment almost to feeling what the content is. And to hear you so, and I would say maybe it's not, but practiced recitation of it gets me past that. And I was able to hear it much deeper than I had before. So I just like to praise that and say that that's another way into poetry, is to hear it, is to listen to good recitation of poetry. Is another way to.
So it's interesting that you say that. Hopkins, I've spent some time reading his journals as well and some stuff related to him. He did that on purpose. So
it's obvious because he really, I mean, if you try to read Windhover, it's like
yes, yeah. I caught this morning and minion. It's like it's almost a tongue twister. Yeah. So this is one of the weird things in which the way these things can operate on a whole bunch of levels at once. So his poems are poetic explorations of inscapes of things, but the poem itself, as you hear it, is supposed to be a repetition of the process by which you have a flash of insight in which sense perception resolves into a coherent thing. So his poetry is orally, intentionally difficult to get through so that at some moment, the third or the fifth time, all of a sudden, oh my goodness, I get what all of it means. I get it now. It hits you. And what he's trying to do is say, like, this is actually what you should expect to work, how your perception should work in reality. And so I want, as Kingfishers Catch Fire is a great one of those, because the last, I say more, the just man justices keeps grace. That keeps all his goings graces, acts out in God's eyes what in God's eyes he is, Christ. That is a mouthful. But then you realize that he's saying so many things. I say more. Are you saying more about how the difference between human ontology and the rest of creation? Yes. Are you saying more about you, Hopkins? Yes. Hopkins says more. Hopkins says more than the bell and the well and the kingfisher. He keeps grace, right? There's, especially understanding Hopkins is a good Catholic, he understands grace as being a participation in a created share of the divine nature. He's saying, I say more, and that like my ontological existence is that of a vessel of divinity in a way that the kingfisher doesn't participate in. And it's that he's riding the fine line. I understand the criticism of Hopkins here. He's riding the fine line of saying so little that it's almost unintelligible. But when you understand it, this is part of what I love about him. When you get it, he has said so much. He said so much with this that it's kind of like the Book of Kells, honestly. Like you look at those illustrated letters and you're like, oh, that's a T? I think it's a T. And then it's definitely a T. And then you start looking at it, you're like, that's a lot of detail. And then you realize that there's actually like 2 or 3 levels of fractal detail down below that. So there's just some kind of aesthetic delight in that. I don't know what it is.